Day 3 is almost done here at MSI in Tallahassee, Florida, which I've heard described as a gem in the crown of America among all of our cities. Very international city. And I'm here with Nick Allen, who probably had a role in the decision to have the event here in Tallahassee, Florida. Nick Allen, first off, why are we here in Tallahassee, Florida?
It's really hot.
Yeah.
That's it. That's all I got.
Realistically, I mean, okay, so last night, I'll tell you the story. I was at a bar with some people, and there was a couple who were sitting there, and they were like, so why y'all in Tallahassee, Florida for this thing? Like, why'd you pick Tallahassee? And I just sort of stared at them blankly for a little bit and then said, I'm not sure. So maybe you can answer that.
Yeah, you're not very creative. Yeah, that's true. Tallahassee is a beautiful city. We'll just start off like that. But also, I mean, putting together an event like this has an insane amount of logistics, and we take a ton of different things into account. One being the sort of like challenging tech requirements to do an event of this scale, making sure that the internet's good, that we can handle all these people, that people can get to the event. So pretty challenging in that regard. There's actually in the greater area, not like necessarily just Tallahassee, but in the southeast specifically, there are a ton of League of Legends players, and so we wanted to do an event on the East Coast and specifically the southeast, so that we could really tap in and engage with that broad base of players. Not to mention Tallahassee's beautiful city. FSU is a great campus. We're really happy to be here.
So this is my counterpoint is that this is a international event, but I would not argue Tallahassee is an international city, which is probably most, I guess the best example of that is that they don't have an international airport. They just have a regional one, right? So I've been talking to players who have had very long flights because of that. So why would Tallahassee not have been a better decision for an LCS location, sort of how you had EU LCS go to Madrid and then have the international event in an international city?
Yeah, I mean, there aren't like necessarily direct flights to Tallahassee, which can be a challenge, but everyone got here. The flights, there's a lot of international airports pretty close by. So ultimately everyone got here in one piece, which is a shame in your regard, Travis. Yeah, okay. But ultimately everyone got here, and it really is to the benefit of a lot of the players and the fan base that's down here. And again, meets all of like sort of the logistical list of things that we need for an event of this scale.
So, but does Tallahassee meet those logistics better than like a Miami or an Orlando or an Atlanta?
Well, I mean, we've learned a lot in terms of planning and where we want to go, and every event that we do, we learn new things. We're happy to be here. Obviously, if it's just like we're going to the biggest and best cities, like we're going to Hong Kong, let's go every time, right? But we want to diversify. We want to be able to satisfy a broad player base, and we started with Tallahassee for this event.
So then should we expect to see, because again, like the joke that I made was that it was very funny to see Shanghai, Paris, Tallahassee. Does that mean that we should expect to see less of the big name cities in the future? I mean, you guys named a lot of big ones for Worlds at least. Maybe for the smaller events, should we expect to see smaller cities?
Absolutely not. I think we'll just continue to diversify. So it's going to be, we don't want to just be exclusive to just big cities. To be perfectly honest, we want to hit all different areas like Tallahassee. Yeah.
So one thing I noticed about Tallahassee is that there seems to be a decent infestation of bugs in the area. Saw a couple on stage actually the other day when we saw a strange situation with Sejuani flashing all across the map. It was very strange. Yeah. No, but their video producer just hung himself. But yeah, there is a lot of conversation around what happened with the Fnatic bug, and then supposedly also there was a Lucian issue getting out of Baron Pit, and then even today like a strange Azir turret bug that I actually missed because I was doing an interview. But let's sort of break it down, starting with the Sejuani bug. So there was a lot of conversation around that. And initially, I've heard a lot of people say, it was a spectator-only bug, and then there's a YouTube video now of people that seem to be able to replicate it very consistently. So what exactly, if you can sort of break down what happened there?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as you probably saw, Sejuani jumped over the wall, kind of got sucked back in. It wasn't exclusively a spectator bug. Something did happen. The player did experience it. We're still trying to figure out exactly what happened. And when we do investigations into a bug like this, it involves a broad set of people within Riot, including a lot of our balance team, our design team, esports, our QA team. So lots of different people that are investigating and trying to figure out exactly what happened, because ultimately our goal is to make sure that that sort of thing doesn't happen in the future. Luckily, we've evolved over time where we have these processes in place to handle these sort of things when they do end up happening.
I mean, do you think that it was a gameplay affecting bug? Since it wasn't just a spectator, like it definitely affected the game, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I would be naive to say that it didn't affect the game. It was obvious that he got pulled back and resulted in his death in the game. So it definitely had an impact.
So a lot of people then would say, okay, well, this changed the course of the game for Fnatic. It wasn't something that was in their control. Like, this was a strange bug. That's not how the game is intended to be played. So why not remake the game then?
Yeah, so ultimately the way that our process works is, and it's stated in our rules, and the teams are well aware of this policy, is the teams need to pause in the case that they see a bug. Then the referees and our team backstage will verify that the bug actually happened. And if we can verify that it truly was a bug and it was critical in the sense that it had an impact on the results of the game, we will offer the disadvantaged team a remake. In that case. So, and the reason we have this particular policy, and there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of questions about this online, is if a team is up, say Fnatic in that game was up 10K gold, for example, we don't want to come in as the referees and the administrators of the game and remake force a remake on the game when Fnatic is in an advantageous position, which is why we actually leave it up to the team in those situations to decide whether or not they're going to remake the game. Again, we don't want to take anything away from the teams. And sorry, yeah.
I was just going to say, so then but it always has to occur in that moment, right? Fnatic cannot finish the game and say, hey, listen, we saw this bug. They have to immediately report it.
Right, that's at the discretion of the ref. So essentially, what we don't want to see is the teams holding on to a bug, and then 3 minutes later in the game, the game turns and they start to lose, and they pause and they go back and like, hey, that's the moment that the game turned, and use the bug as more advantageous later. So there is like this window, and it's not black and white. It's very gray based on the momentum of the game and how things are trending. For the team can then pause and have us investigate the bug. So it's not exactly clear cut, but ultimately it depends on the situation. It's definitely a custom fit solution.
So I've seen a lot of discussion online, even a pro player who had said, like, hey, why is this on the players? Like, in the heat of the moment, they're on the stage and all this stuff, and they're supposed to pause the game and report this. Like, you guys now officially recognize coaches, and obviously there's even more understanding of support staff being a big part of this. So why is it not a possibility for a coach to call for the pause or something like that if he sees something along those lines to start the discussion?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've been thinking about how the coach can play a role in this. One thing we know for sure is that we don't want the coach to have an influence on whether or not the team decides to remake, because ultimately they're backstage and they're going to have information, because they're watching the game from both sides holistically. They're going to have information that the team doesn't, right? So in the case of Fnatic, right, maybe they're up 10 kills, but they're down 5K gold. The coach could come in and be like, you guys, we should remake no matter what, right? Like, you guys are losing the game. You think you're winning, you're not. And so we don't want the coach to have that sort of impact. What we're talking about is maybe the coach can pause the game on behalf of their team. But one of the things we need to think through is, can they use that strategically, right? And is there like indications like, hey, if there's ever a coach pause, it's because I know that you're losing the game, and so you should always get the remake, right? So there's all these different situations that we need to think through before we would add a rule like that into the rule book.
So why is there not a LCS official who, whenever they see a bug, like they're sitting there watching, or somebody, maybe like an additional ref who's watching the game, and when they notice a bug, it's on them to pause and discuss and investigate the bug,
and then present like the. That's an interesting question. I think ultimately momentum is a big part of the game too, and we don't want to kill or hurt momentum of a team fight or something like that that could result in some sort of swing and impact the game, right? So ultimately, we're concerned that a ref initiated pause could have a strong influence on how the game or the team fight plays out. Now, I think there are situations, and I don't think we've really run into them yet, that there probably would be some sort of referee-initiated pause. If there's something that happened to the game that neither team is aware of, that we need to step in and be like, hey guys, like something happened. I mean, ultimately, bugs do happen in our game. this is a quote that a bunch of people throw around, but technology is the vehicle of esports, right? So, and it's not perfect. So ultimately these things can happen. But again, like it's hard to know exactly, and we need to think through what a ref initiated pause, how it could affect the game, and what results there could be.
Do you think that there are lessons or takeaways from this?
Absolutely. I think we need to be thinking about how coaches can play a role. And ultimately, there might be some trade-offs that we need to think about. Coaching is a relatively new role in the league and in these international events. So how they play a part is something that we're still continuing to figure out and learn more about. And then ref-initiated pauses, I think, is something that we will discuss. But again, it's mostly at this point we've been really hesitant to break the flow of the game because it's so important, and even like a small break can swing games, and that's something that we're definitely worried about.
As you guys have been discussing this internally, have you had the discussion yet of, oh, if Fnatic had paused it and requested a remake, would that have happened? I mean, so many people feel like that was perhaps a reason for that game being lost for them. So have you guys had that discussion?
We've talked about it a little bit. Ultimately, we're not sure still up to this point whether or not we would have remade. It did have an impact on the game, clearly. And so we would have came together as a group of referees and a group of administrators and needed to make a tough call in the moment. Ultimately, we're thinking that we might have remade, but it's hard to say at this point, to be perfectly honest.
I would imagine at least that there were conversations with Fnatic following that. What were those conversations like? Were they frustrated or anything along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, hindsight's 2020, right? I think Fabivin went on the record, I believe, and got interviewed. He's like, yeah, we probably should have paused it and looked back. But I mean, they're in a tricky scenario, right? Like, I think a lot of people on Reddit have been discussing if they did remake the game, would they have gotten back to this sort of even playing field that they were on at that point in the game? And it's hard to say. So I think in the moment, it seemed like they chose like, hey, we're in a pretty good position, even with this thing happening, and that we're going to continue on and try to win the game.
One of the interesting things about MSI is that we've seen this new substitution rule come into place, or this new rule rather, where you can bring a player in. Actually, because there's been so much conversation around that, I don't think people have decided to go and actually read like exactly how that whole system works. Do you want to sort of break down directly from your mouth how that whole new rule affects the game and how people can use this?
Right. So basically, we tried to find a middle ground solution between how some of the Asian leagues are really utilizing subs a lot, especially in Korea. We're seeing Easy Hoon, we're seeing Bengi, like we're seeing a lot of these on SKT specifically, a lot of rotating of players. But then on like the NA and the EU side, we're not seeing utilization of subs, and that actually comes from like the rule book and how we've at this point structured the league. So we wanted to find a middle ground where teams that didn't properly or didn't actively utilize subs weren't hyper disadvantaged by having to prepare for 7, 8, 9, 10 players, while the players that utilize all these different subs only have to prepare for 5. And so the middle ground that we figured out, or that we landed on, was each team gets to bring one sub that they can use in for a strategic purpose. It's also there for emergencies in case someone gets sick and can't continue on playing. So it satisfies both those purposes. But the way that it works actively right now is like in the middle of a series, the teams have 5 minutes after the Nexus explodes to let the referees know if they're going to be making a change for the next game. And there's not a lot of time between games in a series, and so they do have what we think is an adequate amount of time to make these calculations and have these discussions to decide who they're going to put in. And then again, for like the BO1s, they have some time the night before. They have some times after there's some time after their games to make changes as well.
So we could have actually seen in the full best of 5 that we saw between Fnatic and SKT, we could have seen a substitution between like game 3 and game 4, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, you can see his substitutions between every single game in a BO5. Okay. Yeah.
And then what do you think, I mean, since we're almost done, I think the final best of 5 is wrapping up right now with grand finals tomorrow. What do you think so far of how that's worked out over the course of this tournament?
I think it's really interesting. I don't think we've really seen very much. I think Izuhoon came in at one point, so there's not a lot of utilization at this point. But I think overall people saw that it was a middle ground solution. I think we're going to be thinking through specifically also for like the NA and the EU LCS what this would look like for maybe next split or next year. And we think in order to get to a place where we're comfortable with everyone using all their subs all the time, the regions need to be on a more even playing field. Otherwise, it's just some teams are just remarkably disadvantaged. So we're going to be thinking through that. Ultimately, I think it's a pretty cool thing for this event.
We're in between the splits right now. After this event, is there a chance that NA and EU LCS teams could see something like this happen for the summer split?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a possibility. We need to think through how all of that would work in the landscape, but there's definitely a chance. It is something that we're thinking about.
And then based on this, should we sort of expect Worlds to be like this? Because it's kind of an interesting situation, right? If you're an NA team and you see, sorry, people walking into the interview room right now. If you're an NA team and you see, like, oh, this is what happened at MSI, this might be the case at Worlds, and SKT seems to be able to utilize it in a very interesting way. Should we expect to hear sort of information around the rule set for Worlds coming soon, and if this will be in play there? Because if I was Team Liquid, for instance, and I had Piglet and Keith who switch back and forth, like I would consider like, okay, maybe I keep Keith around and like sort of play around with this because we had some interesting results from that over the first split and see how it goes into Worlds. So I mean, just in terms of how this is going to work in the next split and going into Worlds, how can NA or EU LCS team prepare?
Yeah, I think Team Liquid is an interesting example where they probably would have had a lot more back and forth. Ultimately, I don't want to commit to anything for Worlds because I think part of Worlds is like the celebration of global competition, and one part of our job is making sure that some regions aren't majorly disadvantaged from by these other regions, and some regions are much more advanced and evolved than others. So part of our job is figuring out how do we balance all these different things. So we definitely can't commit to any one type of rule set or sub situation.
Could you give a timeline on when an NA or EU LCS team could expect to start preparing for this? Because I mean, at some point in time, you put the Worlds rule set out, preferably a significant amount of time before Worlds, because if you're going to have a rule like this in it, you want those guys to be able to prepare for it, right?
Right. I think we would try to give as much heads up as possible. We're in the middle of this event and getting ready for next split, and part of that is all thinking through our potential rule changes. So timeline would be pretty short. If we decided to do something like this, we'd be letting people know relatively soon.
Very good. Hopefully we can expect to hear some news around that soon. We'll hold you to that. Other than that, I just kind of wanted to ask you general thoughts on the event. Any takeaways so far for you in terms of future things that you would do differently about the event, or general thoughts? Has it all been going perfectly?
It definitely had its bumps along the way, just like any event. Again, it's like really challenging logistically to put on something of this scale. A lot of awesome people put in a lot of work to make something cool like this, present company excluded. But overall, I think we're pretty satisfied. I think one of the unfortunate things is the home crowd was rooting for their home team. TSM didn't perform, but that's competition that's outside of our control. But ultimately, yeah, we're pretty dang happy with how things have turned out.
Very good. What happens, by the way, if this thing goes to a best of 5 and we're here till like 2 a.m.?
We don't get a lot of sleep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Well,
Yeah.
looking forward to potentially not getting a lot of sleep if we get the full 10 games. Thank you so much, Nick Allen. Any final words that you'd like to say to any of the fans out there, or probably a lot of haters who are very critical of you and your decision to find so many people?
Yeah, just letting you guys know that we have the best interest of players in the league and League of Legends at heart. And it's always hard to make tough decisions, and that's part of my job and part of the job of a lot of people at Riot. And again, we love you guys, and we want to do the best thing for everyone that loves this game. And thanks for coming out to Tallahassee, and thanks for watching.
Does that mean you love me too?
Let's wrap it.
Check out the rest of our coverage of all things MSI at GameSpot.com/LOL.